We spent a lot of time talking about the brain, but we can't forget the spinal cord, which is an important part of the central nervous system. It's going to be responsible for two main functions. One is going to be the spinal reflex arcs. The other is that it will be a conduit for information that needs to flow from the periphery to the brain and then back out to the periphery. It's about 18 inches long, a little over ½ an inch in diameter. It is going to arise from the medulla oblongata at the level of the foramen magnum, and it will taper to a cone-like structure and end at a point, and that cone-like structure is conveniently known as the conus medullaris. The termination point will be at the L1, L2 disc space. That is going to have extreme clinical significance. If you need an epidural, or if you need to have a lumbar tap done, you will have that done below the level of L1, L2. Why? Because below the level of L1, L2 is a bunch of nerve roots, which happen to be called the cauda equina. If you insert a needle through an intervertebral foramen below the level of L1, L2, you are not terribly likely to damage one of those nerve roots that arises from the distal end of the spinal cord. If you insert a needle superior to the level of L1, L2, you have a far, far greater chance of piercing the spinal cord and potentially, probably at least partially, paralyzing your patient. Hence the clinical significance of the end point of the spinal cord. That's very important for all healthcare practitioners to know. This gives you a couple of images of the spinal cord, again, arising at the, you got it, distal end of the medulla oblongata and terminating in the conus medullaris and giving rise to the cauda equina. Cauda equina is Latin for horse's tail. Those nerve roots that arise from the conus medullaris apparently look like a horse's tail to the anatomists who are dissecting out cadavers. And we also need to talk about the filum terminale. So let's go to this. I'm going to go to this image. So here's the conus medullaris. Here's the cauda equina. And this structure right here, which is going to connect the distal end of the conus medullaris of the spinal cord to the base of the sacrum, is known as the filum terminale, and it exists to keep the spinal cord anchored in place. It is a strand of fibrous connective tissue. This starts to lead into spinal nerves, which we're going to cover in another section. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. This shows you where they arise and gives you some idea of what they supply. It also tells you about the distal end of the spinal cord. Here's the conus medullaris, and here's the cauda equina. White matter versus gray matter. You'll remember in the brain, the most superficial aspect of the brain is that very thin layer known as the cerebral cortex that is going to be in charge of controlling all conscious behavior. Deep to that will be white matter. The opposite is true for spinal cord. You will have superficially white matter, and the gray matter will be deep to the white matter. This is a photograph of a spinal cord. Let's talk a little bit about this. Of course, there will be spinal meninges, just as there are cranial meninges, so the most superficial layer will be dura mater. There will be arachnoid mater, deep to that, and deep to that, following the contours of spinal cord, will be the pia mater. This will be gray matter, and they're called horns, posterior and anterior horn. How do you in the middle, this will be what's known as the gray commissure, which is basically just a way of saying that the two butterfly wings are connected by gray matter. And within that will be the central canal, which holds, yes, cerebrospinal fluid. You remember it. Good. How do you tell the anterior and the posterior aspect of the spinal cord? Oh no, you might have to do that. Yes, yes, you might. Here's one way. Anteriorly, there will be a very deep fissure. It is known as the anterior median fissure. Posteriorly, there will be a little valley, which is known as the posterior median sulcus. So look for a really big fissure because that will be anterior. Why do we care? We care because the anterior aspect of the spinal cord and the posterior aspect of the spinal cord will have different functions. One will be sensory and one will be motor. How do you tell which is which? The posterior aspect will be sensory. It will all be associated with sensory information. How do you remember? Because posterior has an S in it. If the posterior aspect is sensory, you got it. The anterior aspect has to be associated with motor information. So the white matter, and we'll go over this in more detail in a little bit in the next section. The white matter is going to be divided into what are known as 3 columns or funiculi. They will be subdivided into spinal tracts. Ascending tracts carry sensory information, so that will all be running superiorly, coming in from the periphery. Ascending is afferent. Descending tracts will be motor tracts. That will be efferent information, outgoing information. And they'll be located in various parts of the white matter, and we'll talk about that in another section. And all will be named. Some will be conveniently giving you some directional reference, and therefore you can figure out whether or not they are sensory or motor tracts. Stay tuned on that. The gray matter will be divided into horns. And let's take a look at what holds what. The posterior gray horns, posterior for sensory, sure enough, they're going to contain sensory nuclei, both somatic and visceral. The anterior gray horns, sure enough, is going to contain motor nuclei, descending information. Sheesh! The lateral gray horns are only going to be around or exist in the thoracic and lumbar areas. That's it. They're not in the cervical areas. And they will contain visceral motor nuclei. We talked about the gray commissure. It's going to contain axons that cross from one side of the spinal cord to the other. The fancy term for that is decusate. Stay tuned. We'll talk more about that. We know that the anterior aspect of gray matter and white matter is actually going to have motor functions or carry motor functions, and the posterior aspect will have information about sensory functions. Let's take a look at this little diagram here. You can see the butterfly, you can see the gray commissure, you can see the central canal, and then if you take a look at the appendages, for lack of a better word, that come off the spinal cord, they will be either a ventral root or a dorsal root. And you'll see this bumpy thing, which is known as a spinal ganglion, associated with the dorsal root. That dorsal root ganglion is yet another way through which you can identify the anterior versus the posterior aspect of the spinal cord. And we have a better picture of that coming up soon. We talked about the ventral root, we talked about the dorsal root, we already mentioned the dorsal root ganglion. When you hear ganglion, you are talking about a collection of neuronal cell bodies. And the dorsal root ganglion is going to contain cell bodies of sensory afferent neurons. So when you have a fusion or the merging of the ventral root carrying motor information and the dorsal root carrying sensory information, you actually give rise to spinal nerves. Those are what are going to pass through the intervertebral foramen. We'll talk about spinal nerves in another section. Very exciting, stay tuned. So let's take a look at this image. We talked about the dorsal and the ventral horns. We talked about the dorsal root, and we talked about the ventral root. We also talked about the dorsal root ganglion. When the ventral root and the dorsal root merge, you now have a spinal nerve. Take a look at this picture. This giant chunk of tissue right here is the dorsal root ganglion. And if you follow the dorsal root ganglion back to the spinal cord, here's the dorsal root ganglion, here's the dorsal root. And this, my friends, therefore has to be the posterior or dorsal aspect of the spinal cord, and posterior and dorsal both have the S in it for sensory. So there you have it. Anterior median fissure associated with the anterior or ventral aspect of the spinal cord, the dorsal root ganglion or the posterior median sulcus associated with the posterior aspect of the spinal cord. Posterior sensory, anterior motor. That's so easy. We've seen this image when we talked about the spinal cord, but I wanted to show it to you again because it shows you the dorsal and ventral root merging to give rise to spinal nerves. Relative to vertebral bodies, this is going to be a cervical vertebral body. How do I know? Because the transverse foramen here and the bifid spinous process. Yes, how quickly we forget. We need to talk about this too, somatotrophy. It's a fancy way for saying that the spinal cord is unbelievably well organized. Just like the brain, especially the cortex, they are unbelievably well organized. You can innervate specific areas of the motor homunculus or the sensory homunculus, and you can tell what area is innervated because of what responds. Same thing with the spinal cord. It is highly, highly, highly organized. The fancy word for that is somatotrophy. So, on each side of that cord, medial to laterally, they're going to be somatomotor nuclei that are arranged to control muscles that are going to position the pectoral girdle, then muscles that are going to move the forearm and hand, and then muscles that are going to move the hand and the fingers. Am I going to ask you that specifically? No. I want you to remember this somatotrophy and how organized the spinal cord is. This shows you what areas are going to be controlled by various parts of the spinal cord. Green sacral, fuchsia lumbar, red inferior thoracic, light blue, superior thoracic, dark blue cervical. Really amazing and totally cool. You need to know about spinal reflex arc because that is one of the major functions of the spinal cord. So there you are. You decide that you need to make yourself a cup of tea, and you're tired and you're not really thinking, and your phone is ringing, and you're trying to figure out who's calling and whether or not you want to talk to them. And you poured your tea and you put your hands on that really unbelievably hot, steaming cup, and you yank your hand away so you don't burn yourself. This is what happens in order that you protect yourself from being burned. A sensory receptor says, holy cow, you just touched something hot. That information will travel along a sensory afferent neuron to an integration center that is actually in the spinal cord. That information gets processed at the level of the spinal cord of that spinal nerve. You'll have a reaction, which will be sent along a motor neuron to an effector, and in this case, because you yanked your hand away, it's going to be a skeletal muscle. By the time you have yanked your hand away, your association or integration center has sent information to your brain which says, note to self, do not touch a hot cup. Silly person. Let me repeat that, all of this. Receptors in the skin will pick up information and send them along a sensory afferent neuron to an integration center in the spinal cord. An effect, reaction, will be sent along a motor efferent neuron out to an effector, which in this case is skeletal muscle. Processing happens at the level of the spinal cord, doesn't go up to the brain to get processed. And I want you to think about why. And we'll go over that in class as long as someone reminds me as to why we need to talk about that. 100% probability you're going to see questions about spinal reflex arc on either the practical and or the last lecture assessment. You need to know the components of a spinal reflex arc in order: receptor, sensory neuron, integration center, motor neuron, effector. And you also need to know that that information is processed at the level of the spinal cord, of that spinal nerve that's bringing that sensory information in. The brain is not involved in processing that information. It happens all at the level of the spinal cord. You also need to know why that happens at the level of the spinal cord, and the brain is not involved except as a sort of note to self type of thing.